I didn't mean to find it. That's the part that still echoes in my chest when the house goes quiet. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The kind where the light leans soft against the walls and the air smells faintly of starch and old cotton. I was sitting at the dining table with my sewing kit open, the same wooden box I'd carried from house to house for nearly 25 years. The hinges creaked the way they always had, a sound so familiar it felt like a greeting. My fingers were looking for a spool of navy thread when they brushed against something smooth and cold, too smooth to belong there. At first, I thought it was one of those little metal cases for needles, but when I lifted it, my breath caught. It was heavier than it should have been, rectangular, black, and when the light hit it just right, I saw the faint outline of a screen. I stared at it for a long moment before my mind allowed itself to say the words, a phone. Not my phone. Not the old flip phone my husband used to keep in the glove compartment for emergencies. This one was newer, slim, no cracks, no dust. Hidden beneath my pincushion like it was meant to be forgotten or never found. My hand started to shake. Not violently, just enough that I had to set it down before I dropped it. The clock on the wall kept ticking, each second loud and insistent, as if urging me to do something. Or maybe warning me not to. I remember thinking, "You're being dramatic." Clara. That was always my name for myself when things felt like they were spinning. There's a reasonable explanation. There always is, but explanations don't usually hide in sewing kits. Before that moment, my life had been ordinary in the quiet, dependable way I used to take pride in. My husband, Harold, and I had been married for 32 years. We met when we were both working at the county offices, me in records, him in maintenance. He used to bring me coffee in the mornings, always 2 sugars, even after I'd told him a dozen times I was trying to cut back. "Life's already bitter enough," he'd say with that half smile of his. We raised 2 children in that house. Watched them scrape their knees on the driveway, argue over the last pancake on Saturday mornings, and eventually pack up their rooms with boxes labeled college and first apartment. The house learned our rhythms. It creaked when Harold walked down the hall at night. It hummed when I baked bread on Sundays. It held our arguments and our laughter without judgment. These days, it was just the two of us. Mornings were quiet. Harold left early for work at the auto parts warehouse, and I stayed behind with my coffee, my radio turned low, and whatever small project I'd lined up for the day. Sewing had become my comfort. Mending hems for the church ladies, fixing buttons, quilting scraps into something useful. There was something honest about it, taking what was worn and making it whole again. Looking back, I can see the small changes I ignored. Harold had started guarding his phone like it was a secret he couldn't afford to lose. He used to leave it on the kitchen counter, screen face up, buzzing with texts from coworkers or the kids. Lately, it stayed in his pocket. Even at dinner, he'd set it beside his plate, face down, his hand resting near it like a reflex. He'd also begun stepping outside to take calls. Not every time, but often enough that I noticed. "Warehouse stuff," he'd say when I asked, shrugging off my curiosity. "You know how it is." I did know how it was. Or at least, I thought I did. We still ate dinner together most nights. Still talked about bills and weather and what the kids were up to. But there was a thinness to his attention, like he was listening from another room. Sometimes I'd catch him smiling at nothing, a private little curve of the lips that vanished when he saw me watching. I told myself it was stress, or age, or just the way marriages settle into quieter shapes after so many years. The day I found the phone, Harold wasn't home yet. The house felt too still, as if it knew I'd uncovered something it had been holding on to. I picked the phone up again, my thumb hovering over the side button. I didn't press it right away. I thought about all the years we'd shared, all the reasons not to look, but curiosity has a way of sounding like reason when your heart is. Already uneasy. The screen lit up. No lock screen photo. No notifications. Just the time and date staring back at me, clean and empty. A second phone. No case, no scratches. Hidden where only I would ever think to look. I sat there for a long while, the phone resting in my palm like a weight I didn't know how to carry. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Life went on, unaware that something in my chest had shifted, slow and irreversible. When Harold finally came home that evening, I was standing at the sink, washing dishes that were already clean. He kissed my cheek like he always did, quick and familiar. "Smells good in here," he said, loosening his tie. I smiled back because that's what I'd always done. Because sometimes it's easier to pretend you haven't seen the crack forming. But all through dinner, my eyes kept drifting to his pocket, and every tick of the clock sounded like a countdown. I didn't know it yet, but that small black phone had already begun to unravel everything I thought I understood about my life. And once a thread like that starts to pull, there's no stopping what comes undone. Asterisk curled breathing rose and fell beside me, steady and untroubled, the way it always had. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling fan, counting its rotations like they might add up to an answer. Every so often, I turned my head just enough to look at him in the dark, the faint outline of his face softened by years and habit. This was the man who held my hand through 2 labors, who sat with me in a hospital room when my mother died, who once drove 3 hours in the rain because I'd left my purse at a rest stop. And yet, somewhere between the ticking clock and the hum of the fan, there was another man. One who hid phones and sewing kits. In the early morning, I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake him. The floorboards creaked anyway. This house never missed a chance to announce movement, but he didn't stir. In the kitchen, I made coffee I didn't want and sat at the table with the phone in front of me, my hands wrapped around a mug for something solid to hold. I told myself I wouldn't go through it, that I'd simply ask him. 32 years deserved at least that much dignity, but dignity has a way of dissolving when the truth is within reach. I pressed the home button again. Still no lock. The wallpaper was plain, a default blue gradient, like someone hadn't bothered to personalize it. That alone felt telling. Harold was the kind of man who put photos of our kids on everything: wallet, desk, even his old phone case. This phone felt TEMPORARY. I opened the messages first. There weren't many threads, which made my chest tighten. One, in particular, sat at the top. No name. Just a number I didn't recognize. The most recent message read, "Did you get home okay?" My fingers hovered over the screen. The timestamp was from the evening before, around the time he'd said he was working late. CROLED. The conversation unfolded in fragments, like stepping into the middle of a story I was never meant to hear. Casual words at first, short check-ins, then longer messages, laughter spelled out in little bursts of and heart emojis that made my stomach twist. There were no explicit declarations, no photographs, but there was intimacy in the way they spoke to each other, the kind that doesn't need explanation. "I miss your voice. Wish I could see you today. Soon, asterisk. Soon." That word echoed louder than anything else on the screen. I set the phone down and stood up too fast, my chair scraping against the floor. The room tilted slightly, and I had to grip the counter until it passed. I wasn't crying yet. I felt hollow, like my insides had been scooped out and replaced with air. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the house wake up. The refrigerator clicked on. The radio in the living room crackled as it picked up a station. Morning light crept across the table where Harold and I had eaten dinner less than 12 hours earlier. When he came into the kitchen, he noticed the coffee first. "You're up early," he said, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Everything okay?" I turned slowly, the phone still in my hand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply held it out between us like an offering. "What is this, Harold?" I asked. He froze, just for a second. But after all these years, I knew that pause the way I knew the lines on his face. It was the pause of a man calculating. "That," he said, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite land. "It's nothing, Clara, just a work phone." "A work phone?" I repeated softly. "Yes, they're trying something new at the warehouse." "Inventory system." He reached for it, but I pulled my hand back. "Since when do they send heart emojis about inventory?" I asked as his mouth opened, then closed. The color drained from his face in a way I'd never seen before. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, elbows on the table, head in his hands. "Clara." He started. I waited. The clock ticked. The coffee cooled. Finally, he looked up at me, eyes wet. Shoulders slumped like he'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," he said. It was the moment the last thread snapped. "Find out what, Harold?" My voice was steady, even though my hands were trembling now. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my husband has been living another life." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it hurt. "It's not what you think." I laughed then, a short, brittle sound that surprised us both. "That's the oldest line in the book," I said. "Try again." Silence stretched between us. Finally, he exhaled, long and defeated. "There's someone else," he said. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did. The words landed softly, but their weight was crushing. "How long?" I asked. He hesitated. "Almost a year." "A year." 4 seasons, birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners. All of it layered over a secret life I never saw. "Who is she?" I asked. He looked away. "You don't know her." That answer didn't comfort me the way he seemed to think it would. I left the kitchen then. Not because I was done, but because I was afraid of what I might say if I stayed. I went into the sewing room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the open kit where the phone had been hidden. My kit, my quiet place. Violated in a way that felt personal and cruel. When I finally cried, it was silent. My body folded in on itself, grief pressing down from every direction. I wasn't just mourning a betrayal, I was mourning the life I thought I had. The trust I'd given freely. That day passed in a blur. Harold tried to talk. I asked him to leave me alone. He slept on the couch. I didn't touch my sewing kit. By the next morning, something inside me had hardened, not into anger, but into resolve. I knew then that I couldn't simply accept half-truths and apologies. If my life was going to be torn apart, I needed to see the full shape of it, and that meant learning everything he'd been hiding. Asterisk, I didn't tell anyone at first. Not my sister, who called every Sunday afternoon. Not my children, who were busy building lives of their own and didn't need their mother unraveling over the phone. I moved through the days quietly, like a guest in my own home, observing everything with new eyes. Harold tried to act normal. He made breakfast, asked if I needed anything from the store, said goodnight from the couch, like this was some temporary inconvenience we'd laugh about later. Each small kindness felt heavier than cruelty would have. I watched him closely now, the way his hand lingered near his pocket, the way his eyes flicked to his phone when it buzzed. His regular phone, the one he still carried openly. I wondered how many versions of him there were. One morning, after he left for work, I went back to the sewing kit. I opened it slowly, as if the phone might leap out and bite me. I picked it up and turned it on again, my heart pounding like I was doing something wrong. This time I looked deeper. I checked the call logs. Numbers I didn't recognize, repeated often. I checked the calendar, empty but recently cleared. That, too, felt like a confession. Then I opened the photos. At first, there was nothing, just the default camera roll. But when I tapped into the trash folder, my breath caught. There were pictures there. Not many, just enough. A woman's hand on a table, fingers wrapped around a mug I recognized. That mug had been a gift from my daughter last Christmas. Another photo showed a blurred reflection in a mirror, two figures standing close, his arm unmistakably familiar. And then one picture that felt like a punch to the chest. The two of them sitting in my car, the betrayal sharpened, becoming specific and personal. This wasn't some abstract mistake. This was my life being borrowed and rearranged without my consent. I sank into the chair, phone slipping from my hand onto my lap. The woman wasn't young. She wasn't some wild fantasy. She looked ordinary, brown hair pulled back, lines at the corners of her eyes. Someone who knew what it meant to build a life and risk it anyway. I felt a strange mix of anger and pity for her. And for myself, that afternoon, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Just a quiet, determined shift. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to understand exactly what had been taken from me, and then I was going to decide what I deserved. When Harold came home that evening, I was waiting for him at the table. The phone sat between us, turned face up. "I know you're still talking to her," I said. He stopped short, keys dangling from his hand. "I told you, Clara, I ended it." I slid the phone toward him. "Then you won't mind explaining why she texted you this morning?" His shoulders sagged. He didn't even try to deny it this time. He sat down slowly, like a man accepting a sentence. "She needed closure," he said weakly. "No," I replied. "You needed comfort." The truth hung there, undeniable. I asked him everything then. Where they met, how often they saw each other, what he told her about me. Each answer cut, but I needed the clarity. I needed to hear it in his voice, to feel the finality of it. Her name was Elaine. She worked at the same warehouse in a different department. It started with lunches, complaints, two people feeling invisible in their own homes, or so he claimed. I listened without interrupting, even when his explanations slid too easily into excuses. When he finished, I sat back in my chair and folded my hands. "I want you to leave," I said. His head snapped up. "What?" "I want you to pack a bag and go stay somewhere else. For now. You're throwing away 32 years over a mistake?" His voice cracked, indignation bleeding through guilt. I looked at him steadily. "No," I said. "I'm protecting what's left of myself." He left that night. The house felt cavernous without him, every sound amplified. I slept alone in our bed, staring at the empty space beside me, feeling both relieved and unbearably sad. In the days that followed, I began to take stock of my life in ways I never had before. I reviewed bank statements, insurance policies, titles, not because I was planning revenge, but because I refused to be blindsided again. Trust, once broken, makes an accountant out of even the most sentimental heart. That's when I noticed the withdrawals, small amounts at first. Then larger ones, always cash, always spaced out just enough to avoid attention. My stomach tightened as I added them up. Money we'd set aside for retirement, for emergencies, for the future I believed in. When I confronted Harold over the phone, his silence said more than his eventual confession. "I helped her out a little," he said. "She was going through a rough patch." "A rough patch?" I repeated. "With our money?" He didn't answer. Something in me went cold then. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about choice, about priorities, about the ease with which he'd sacrificed our security for someone else's comfort. That night, I called my sister. She listened without interrupting, her breath sharp on the other end of the line. When I finished, she said quietly, "You don't deserve this." I knew that. But knowing and acting are two different things. By the end of the week, I'd scheduled a meeting with a lawyer. I didn't know if I was ready to leave, but I needed to know my options. I needed to feel some ground beneath my feet again. As I drove to the appointment, my hands steady on the wheel, I realized something unexpected beneath the grief and anger. There was a thin thread of strength I didn't know I still had. And once you feel that thread, you start to pull it carefully, deliberately, until something new begins to take shape. The lawyer's office smelled like lemon polish and old paper, the kind of place where people came to untangle their lives one document at a time. I sat across from a woman named Marjorie, her hair pulled into a neat bun, glasses perched low on her nose as she flipped through the paperwork I'd brought. Bank statements, insurance forms, a marriage certificate yellowed at the edges. She didn't rush me. That alone felt like kindness. When did you first notice the withdrawals? She asked gently after he left, I said. But they'd been happening for months. She nodded, jotting notes. You're not foolish for trusting your husband, she said, as if reading my thoughts. And you're not wrong for protecting yourself now. I walked out of that office with a folder tucked under my arm and a strange mixture of fear and clarity in my chest. Divorce wasn't a word I'd ever pictured attaching itself to my name. It felt heavy, permanent, but so did betrayal. Harold called that evening. His voice sounded tired, stripped of its usual confidence. I met with Elaine, he said. I closed my eyes. Why are you telling me this? She knows I need to fix things with you, he continued, ignoring the question. She agreed to step back. I waited for the relief I was supposed to feel. It didn't come. You should have stepped back the first time you had a phone in my sewing kit, I said quietly. Silence stretched between us again. That silence had become familiar, less awkward now. More honest. Thought over the next few weeks, the truth rippled outward whether I wanted it to or not. My sister told my brother. My daughter noticed something was wrong the moment I hesitated on the phone. Eventually, I sat both my children down at the kitchen table and told them what their father had done. They reacted differently, as children often do. My son went quiet, jaw clenched, anger simmering beneath the surface. My daughter cried openly, her pain mirroring my own in a way that broke my heart. We love you, Mom, she said, reaching across the table for my hand. No matter what happens. That was the moment I realized this story wasn't just mine. Harold's choices had splintered more than our marriage. They'd reminded our children that parents are human and that humans fail. Word travels fast in a town like ours. At church, women I'd known for years hugged me a little tighter. Some avoided my eyes altogether. A few, brave or foolish enough, offered advice I hadn't asked for. Men get restless at that age. One woman whispered, as if explaining a natural disaster. I smiled politely and changed the subject. Restlessness doesn't empty joint accounts or erase decades of trust. The public consequence came quietly but firmly. Elaine transferred to a different location after rumors reached management. Harold's supervisor called him in for a conversation, a word that carried more weight than it sounded like. He came home one afternoon uninvited and sat across from me at the same table where so many truths had been laid bare. They know, he said, about us. I folded a dish towel carefully, aligning the corners. Actions tend to speak, I replied. He looked older then. Smaller, like the man I'd married had finally caught up to the years he'd been dodging. I want to come home, he said. I met his gaze. I want peace. Those two wants didn't align the way they once had. In the end, the decision unfolded not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet realizations. I liked the way the house felt when I rearranged it without asking. I liked choosing my own routines. I liked the absence of suspicion. We filed the papers together, a strange cooperation born from shared history. There were tears, apologies, regret spoken too late to change anything. The day Harold moved the last of his things out, I stood in the doorway and watched him load his car. He paused, keys in hand. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. I believed him, and that somehow made it harder. "I know," I replied, "but intent doesn't erase impact." After he drove away, I went back inside and opened my sewing kit. I removed the pincushion, the scissors, the spools of thread. I cleaned it out completely. Then I lined the bottom with fresh fabric, bright and new. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small moments. The first night I slept through without waking. The first time I laughed without guilt. The first dress I mended for myself instead of someone else. I wasn't the same woman who'd found that phone on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. But I was still here, still capable of rebuilding Dot, and sometimes that's the bravest thing of all. Dot asterisk asterisk in the weeks after Harold moved out, time behaved strangely. Some days raced by, filled with errands and paperwork and long conversations with my sister over the phone. Other days dragged their feet, heavy and slow, as if the hours themselves were grieving. I started taking walks in the mornings, something I'd never made time for before. Just me, the quiet streets, and the sound of my shoes against the pavement. At first, it felt lonely. Then it began to feel like space I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I passed houses where I'd watched other lives unfold. Children waiting for school buses. Couples arguing softly on front porches. A woman my age watering her plants, waving at me like we shared a secret. I wondered how many of them were carrying stories they never spoke aloud. One afternoon, I ran into Elaine. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No confrontation like the movies promise. I was in the grocery store, studying a shelf of canned soup, when I felt a presence beside me. I turned, and there she was, holding a basket with just a few items inside. We stared at each other for a second too long. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice low. "For everything." I studied her face, the lines, the tired eyes. She looked exactly like someone who'd made a series of bad decisions and now had to live with them. "I believe you are," I said. And I meant it. She nodded, relief and shame crossing her features in equal measure. Then she walked away, leaving me alone in the aisle with a strange sense of closure I hadn't expected. That night, I told my daughter about the encounter. She listened carefully, then said, "You're stronger than you think." "Mom, maybe, or maybe I was just tired of carrying anger. That didn't belong to me anymore." The divorce finalized on a gray Thursday morning. No courtroom drama, just signatures, stamps, and the quiet acknowledgement that a chapter had closed. When I walked out of the building, I paused on the steps and took a deep breath. The air felt cold and clean in my lungs. I didn't celebrate, but I didn't collapse either. Slowly, I began to imagine a future that belonged only to me. I rearranged the spare room into a proper sewing studio, sunlight pouring through the window in the afternoons. I took on new projects, not just mending but creating quilts with bold patterns, colors I'd never dared to use before. People noticed the change. "You seem lighter," a friend said at church one Sunday. "I am," I replied, surprised to find it was true. Harold and I spoke occasionally, mostly about practical matters. There was no bitterness in our conversations, just a shared understanding that what we'd had was finished. He told me he'd started counseling. I hoped it helped him, not for my sake, but for his. One evening, as I sorted through old photographs, I found a picture from our early years. We were young, standing in front of our first apartment, arms around each other, grinning like we'd figured life out. I held the photo for a long time, honoring what had been real, without letting it anchor me to what no longer was. Love, I realize, doesn't disappear just because trust does. It transforms, sometimes into memory, sometimes into a lesson. On the anniversary of the day I'd found the phone, I opened my sewing kit again. It no longer held secrets, just tools neatly arranged, ready for whatever I chose to make next. I thought about how easily my life had split into before and after, how a single hidden object had forced me to see what I'd been avoiding, and how, in the end, the discovery hadn't destroyed me, it had clarified me. I sat by the window that evening, needle moving steadily through fabric, the rhythm calming and sure. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting the room in gold. I wasn't healed completely, but I was healing, and sometimes that's enough to begin again. Healing didn't arrive with a trumpet sound or a sudden sense of victory. It arrived the way most honest things do, quietly, almost shyly asking permission before settling in. There were still mornings I reached across the bed out of habit, my hand meeting cool sheets instead of a familiar shoulder. Still moments when a memory surfaced without warning, Harold laughing over a burnt roast, Harold dancing badly in the kitchen, Harold holding my face between his hands and telling me we'd be all right. Those memories no longer cut the way they once had, but they did ache. Like an old joint before rain, I let the ache be what it was. I learned not to rush myself past it. One afternoon, my sister came over with a box of old fabric scraps she'd found in her attic. We spread them out across the table, touching each piece, naming where it might have come from. Dresses worn once, curtains faded by sun, pieces of other lives, other homes. You always fix things, she said, watching me sort them. But this time, you made something new. I thought about that later, alone in my sewing room, about how often women are praised for endurance instead of transformation, about how long I've mistaken loyalty for self-erasure. I hadn't failed my marriage. It had simply reached a truth it could no longer avoid. In the spring, I took a short trip by myself, just 2 hours away, a small town with antique shops and a river that moved slow and patient. I checked into a modest inn, unpacked a single bag, and sat on the edge of the bed listening to unfamiliar sounds. For the first time in decades, every decision was mine alone. What to eat, when to sleep, where to wander. That freedom felt tender, almost fragile, but it was real. On my last night there, I sat by the river as the sun slipped down behind the trees. The water reflected the sky in soft streaks of orange and blue, never holding the same shape for long. I thought about how life keeps moving, whether we're ready or not, and how sometimes the only choice we're given is whether to move with it or be dragged along. I chose to move. When I came home, the house welcomed me back like an old friend. I planted flowers in the yard that Harold had never liked, bright ones that refused subtlety. I joined a small quilting group at the community center, women of all ages stitched together by shared stories and quiet understanding. We talked about patterns and fabric, yes, but also about grief, joy, and the way life reroutes us without asking. One evening, my son called. We talked about nothing in particular, the weather, his work, a recipe he was trying. Before hanging up, he paused. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said. My throat tightened. "Thank you," I replied, meaning it with my whole heart. Pride had never been something I'd sought, but strength earned, not imposed, felt different. It felt like something I could carry forward. I still keep the sewing kit, not because of what it once held, but because of what it represents now. A reminder that what's hidden eventually asks to be seen. That truth, however painful, clears space for honesty. And that even after betrayal, a person can choose dignity over bitterness. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I think back to that first moment, the weight of the phone in my hand, the way the world seemed to tilt. If I could speak to that version of myself, I wouldn't warn her or soften what was coming. I would simply tell her this: you survive it. And more than that, you grow. Because in the end, My story wasn't about a second phone dot, it was about reclaiming my voice.